In June of 2020, the President of the United States stood inside a Dallas megachurch and pointed to the man standing next to him. He called him great people with a great reputation. That man was RobertMorris. At the time, he led one of the largest churches in the entire country, a congregation of more than 100,000 people spread across 9 campuses, with sermons broadcast into 190 nations. He had a radio show reaching thousands of cities. He'd written best-selling books. He sat on a presidential faith advisory board. He trained the next generation of pastors at his own university. For years later, that same man stood in a different room, an Oklahoma courtroom, and pleaded guilty to 5 felony counts of sexually abusing a child. What makes this story different from a simple scandal isn't just the fall. It's the fact that the woman he abused spent almost 40 years trying to make people listen. She emailed his own church and got a response that minimized what she told them. She testified in front of state lawmakers. She was offered money in silence, and she said no. And for most of those 40 years, the system built around protecting that one man worked exactly as designed. This is a complete story of RobertMorris, Gateway Church, and everything legal, financial, and institutional that kept this case buried for 4 decades before it finally, fully came apart. To understand how this case stayed quiet for so long, you have to understand the kind of institution RobertMorris built and the specific culture that institution operated inside. Robert Preston Morris was born on July 29, 1961, in Marshall, Texas. He grew up Baptist, attended Pine Tree High School in Longview, and went on to East Texas Baptist College before training at a Bible Institute in East Dallas. Nothing about that resume predicts what came next. His career began the way a lot of evangelical careers in the South began in that era, not behind a single pulpit, but on the road as a traveling evangelist. That role meant moving from congregation to congregation, sometimes staying in the homes of families who'd invite him in, feed him, and treat him like an extension of their own household. It's a structure built entirely on trust, and on the assumption that someone who preaches the gospel for a living has earned that trust automatically. That structure is exactly what put a young, 20-something RobertMorris inside a Texas family's home for days and weeks at a time. It's the same structure that gave him access to one particular 12-year-old girl, whose family had become close enough with his that they traveled together. In 2000, Morris and his wife, Debbie, planted Gateway Church in Southlake, Texas. The very first service was held in a hotel ballroom at a Hilton in nearby Grapevine, about as humble a starting point as a megachurch can have. What happened over the next 2 decades was, by any measure, an extraordinary institutional rise. By 2003, the church had already outgrown its early home and relocated to a property on Southlake Boulevard. By 2010, Gateway had completed a new 64-acre campus anchored by a sanctuary that seated 4,000 people. The church kept expanding. New campuses across the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex, then outposts as far away as Jackson Hole, Wyoming, and St. Louis, Missouri. By the early 2020s, Gateway had 9 campuses and reported more than 100,000 active attendees, with weekly in-person attendance regularly topping 25,000, numbers that, depending on the ranking system used, placed it among the 9 largest churches in the United States, generating roughly $100 million a year in revenue. And the in-person numbers were just a visible part of the empire. Morris hosted a daily radio program, broadcast into more than 6,800 cities. His television ministry aired in 190 countries. He wrote multiple best-selling books, The Blessed Life, Beyond Blessed, The God I Never Knew, Frequency, that collectively sold in the millions of copies and made him a fixture in a particular strand of American Christianity, often described as a prosperity gospel. Broadly, the idea that faith and financial generosity toward ministry are directly connected to material blessing. His sermon clips on YouTube alone drew more than 7 million views. He didn't stop at building a congregation. He built infrastructure to train the next generation in his own image. In 2009, Morris partnered with Minister Jack Hafer to open a Southlake branch of a small religious college, the King's University. By 2014, that branch had become the school's primary campus. By 2023, Morris himself held the title of chancellor, meaning for years, aspiring pastors were trained inside an institution where he held ultimate authority, learning ministry from a man who was, at that very time, sitting on a known allegation from his own past. And then there's a political dimension, which mattered enormously to how untouchable Morris seemed. In 2016, then-candidate Donald Trump named Morris to his Evangelical Executive Advisory Board, a group of prominent religious leaders assembled to advise the campaign and later the administration on issues important to evangelical voters. Morris kept that role for years. In 2020, Trump personally visited Gateway's Dallas campus for a roundtable discussion on race relations and policing, publicly praising Morris by name in front of cameras. The following year, when Trump reassembled a faith advisory board after leaving office, Morris was invited back onto it. He was even present at the White House Rose Garden ceremony announcing Amy Coney Barrett's Supreme Court nomination, a level of access to political power that very few American pastors of any denomination ever achieve. Stack all of that up, congregation size, media reach, an entire university, $100 million a year in revenue, a seat at the table with the president, and you get a portrait of a man who had built, brick by brick, one of the most well-defended platforms in American religious life. Now hold that picture in your head, because everything you just heard was happening at the exact same time that a woman in Oklahoma was trying repeatedly to tell people what Robert Morris had done to her as a child. Before going further into the institution, it's worth slowing down and talking about the person at the center of this, because in a lot of true crime coverage, the survivor becomes a footnote to the perpetrator's story. That's not what should happen here. Cindy Clemishier grew up in Hominy, a small town in Oklahoma, in a working family whose path crossed with Robert Morris's through their shared religious community. In the early 1980s, when Morris was a young, married traveling evangelist building relationships with congregations across Texas and Oklahoma, the Clemishires were exactly the kind of family that opened its home to him when he came through town to preach. By every outward appearance, this was simply a small-town family welcoming a young minister into their lives. According to Clemishier's own account, that closeness is what made the abuse possible, and what made it nearly impossible to escape for years. She has said the abuse began on Christmas night of 1982, when she was 12 years old and Morris was in his early 20s. She has said it continued for roughly 4.5 years, until 1987, when she finally told a friend what had been happening, and that friend convinced her to tell her parents. What followed wasn't justice. It was something closer to a quiet, internal church disciplinary process, one that, remarkably, predates Gateway Church's existence entirely. Here's a detail that complicates the entire nobody-knew narrative in the most direct way possible. Robert Morris had already been caught and disciplined for this once before, 13 years before Gateway Church even existed. According to Morris's own later statement, in March of 1987, the situation involving Clemishier was, in his words, brought to light. He has said he confessed it and submitted himself to the elders of Shady Grove Church and to Clemishier's father. According to Morris, those elders asked him to step out of ministry temporarily and to receive counseling, what he referred to as freedom ministry, which he says he did. Then he went right back to building a ministry career. Within roughly 13 years of that 1987 confession, Robert Morris had founded Gateway Church and was on his way to becoming one of the most prominent pastors in the country. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because it reframes everything that came after. The 2024 scandal wasn't the system failing for the first time. It was the system failing for at least a second time. A pastor confesses, faces a brief, informal, church-run consequence, and is fully restored to ministry within little more than a decade, with no public disclosure, no criminal referral, and apparently no lasting barrier to building an even larger platform than before. Years later, Clemishier tried again, this time in writing with a paper trail. In the mid-2000s, after years of counseling, and after watching a television program about grooming and abuse, Clemishier said she finally recognized what had happened to her as a crime, not a private failure of her own. In 2005, she began writing directly to Morris at his Gateway Church email address, asking him to acknowledge the harm and compensate her for what she says he'd inflicted. By 2007, she'd hired an attorney to formalize that demand. On January 30th, 2007, that attorney sent a letter to Morris's representative laying out, in detail, The abuse Clemenshire said she suffered between 1982 and 1987, and describing how Morris had led her to believe they shared a special relationship that had to remain secret, convincing her as a child that she was somehow responsible for what he had done to her. The response from Morris's side, according to correspondence later obtained by reporters, was to blame the 12-year-old for what happened. Morris's attorney at the time pushed back against the claim, framing the contact as something the child had initiated. That same attorney has separately represented other religious figures accused of mishandling or concealing sexual abuse allegations within their own denominations, meaning Morris's defense, at this critical 2007 juncture, was being handled by someone who specialized in managing exactly this kind of institutional crisis. Now, separately from that direct legal exchange, a Gateway elder named Tom Lane also received a version of Clemenshire's account around this time, sent to the church's own email system. Clemenshire maintains his response acknowledged her account of the timeline, including her age. Lane has since said he understood the relationship to be with a young lady he believed was at least 16, the age of consent in Oklahoma, not 12. Sit with that gap for a second. 16 versus 12. That's the difference between, in the elder's framing, an arguably consensual relationship with an older teenager and the documented sexual abuse of a child barely past elementary school, abuse the church's own founding pastor had already confessed to once, back in 1987. If church leadership genuinely missed that detail in 2005, it raises real questions about due diligence. If they didn't miss it, it raises far darker ones. Either way, for nearly 2 decades after that email, RobertMorris kept preaching to tens of thousands of people every week, completely unimpeded. Gateway's institutional track record on these issues wasn't limited to the Morris case, either, which matters for understanding whether what happened here was one bad decision or a recurring institutional habit. In 2020, a lawsuit alleged that at least 5 Gateway staff members had covered up a separate report of sexual assault involving a minor. That case was settled quietly that year and went almost entirely unnoticed publicly until it resurfaced in 2024. Once Morris's resignation put the entire church's history under a microscope. Then, in 2023, a woman who'd worked as an administrative assistant for a different Gateway pastor alleged she was sexually harassed by him, and that when she reported it, she was the one fired, while the pastor she'd accused received a 2-year severance package on his way out. The church quietly settled that case in June of 2024, the exact same month the Morris allegations were detonating into public view. 3 separate incidents, spanning at least 2 decades, involving different victims, different alleged perpetrators, and different points in the church's history. The institutional reflex each time looks remarkably consistent. Manage the information internally, protect the person with the title, and let whoever raised the alarm absorb the consequences quietly. For almost 40 years, what happened to Cindy Clemenshire mostly stayed behind closed doors, known only to a small circle of people inside 2 different church leadership structures. That changed in June of 2024. On June 14th, a religious accountability blog called the Wartburg Watch, a site that specifically tracks misconduct inside evangelical institutions, published Clemenshire's account publicly for the first time. The story didn't stay contained for long. Within days, it had spread through religious media, then national news. Gateway's elders moved into damage control almost immediately. Their first public statement claimed they hadn't had all the facts before the story broke and announced an independent investigation. RobertMorris's own language was just as revealing as the elders. He acknowledged what he called inappropriate sexual behavior with a young lady, careful, clinical, minimizing phrasing that, even now, decades later, never specified her age and never used the word abuse. That framing didn't survive contact with the actual details. As more specifics emerged publicly, that the victim was 12 when it started and the abuse spanned roughly 5 years, the gap between the language Morris was using and what had actually happened became impossible to paper over. On June 18th, 2024, just days after the story broke, Morris resigned from Gateway Church. The institutional fallout came fast and from multiple directions at once. The Daystar television network, which had carried Morris's programming almost every day of the week, pulled all of it from the air. Morris had also been serving as an overseer at Church of the Highlands, the largest church in Alabama, When that church's trustees learned of the allegations, they opened their own review, and Morris resigned that position too. Texas state lawmakers piled on publicly. State Representatives Giovanni Caprillion and Nate Schatzline, along with former Southlake Mayor John Huffman, all condemned Morris by name. Gateway also canceled its annual 3-day church conference, an event that normally drew thousands of attendees from outside congregations entirely. And then came the detail that mattered most for Gateway's future. James Morris, who'd been groomed for years to take over as senior pastor in 2025, along with his wife and the church's executive pastor, Bridget Morris, were asked to take a temporary leave of absence while Gateway conducted its internal investigation. And on July 31st, both formally resigned from every position they held at the church. In a matter of about 6 weeks, the succession plan, the broadcast empire, the cross-state ministry alliances, and the political relationships Robert Morris had spent 24 years constructing all came apart, almost simultaneously. What happened to Gateway Church institutionally over the following year is, on its own, a remarkable case study in how fast a $100 million a year religious organization can unravel once trust collapses. In the immediate aftermath of Morris's resignation, Gateway brought in two outside, well-respected figures, Max Lucado, a prominent pastor from Oak Hills Church in San Antonio, and Joachim Lundquist, a Swedish minister, to serve as interim teaching pastors while the church searched for permanent leadership. What was originally planned as a short-term arrangement through the end of 2024 stretched on far longer, because Gateway simply didn't have a stable bench of leaders left to promote from within. The numbers tell the rest of the story. By October 2024, attendance at Gateway's flagship Southlake campus had dropped by roughly 40%, with attendance across all 7 Texas campuses down by nearly a quarter overall. Financial giving fell even harder and faster. By mid-November, church elder Kenneth Fambro told staff in an internal video that tithing, the donations that fund virtually everything a church does, had dropped between 35% and 40% since the allegations became public. The financial damage triggered real consequences. Gateway announced staff layoffs and a broader restructuring, eliminating entire departments in some cases. By mid-2025, the church had cut Saturday services at every campus except its main Southlake location, consolidating to Sundays only at most locations specifically to cope with the lost revenue and lost staff capacity. And the financial bleeding compounded with a separate, parallel legal problem. In October 2024, a group of Gateway church members filed a class action lawsuit alleging the church had misspent millions of dollars in donations that were supposed to fund global missions work, claiming Morris had previously told a conference audience that 15 to 20% of the church's roughly $100 million annual revenue went toward overseas ministries, when the actual figure, according to a CPA who had overseen that arm of the church, was closer to $3 million. By early 2025, a related federal version of that case was also working through the courts, with Morris's own legal team trying to get dismissed on jurisdictional grounds, arguing the court lacked authority because all the parties involved resided in the same state. Leadership turnover compounded the financial collapse. By January 2025, Gateway was down to just 3 sitting elders, after 9 different church leaders had either resigned or been removed since the scandal broke the previous summer. The church brought in 4 new interim elders on 6-month trial appointments, hoping to rebuild a functioning board almost from scratch. Even that rebuilding effort hit turbulence. That same August, Gateway's executive pastor, Kimmel Glasgow, was fired over what the church only described publicly as a moral issue, without further detail. Meanwhile, James and Bridget Morris didn't disappear from ministry entirely. Rather than waiting for Gateway to recover, the two began working to start an entirely new congregation of their own, Passage Church, searching for a location in Roanoke, Texas area to begin holding regular services. In other words, in less than 18 months, the church Robert Morris built over 24 years lost a quarter of its members, nearly half its donor base, almost its entire leadership structure, and its own designated successor, who left to start competing ministry down the road. Gateway wasn't the only institution that took damage from this story, because Robert Morris's network extended well beyond his own church, and at least one other major ministry got pulled directly into the fallout. New Life Church in Colorado Springs, Colorado, itself a large and influential evangelical congregation, saw its senior pastor, Brady Boyd, resigned after an internal investigation found he had been party to at least 20 emails relating to the Clemisher allegations, despite having previously denied knowing the victim's age. The investigation also found that Clemisher's own sister had specifically warned New Life's hiring committee about Boyd's appointment at some point in the past, a warning that, like the 2005 email to Gateway, appears to have been absorbed by the institution rather than acted on. 2 other New Life elders were also asked to resign once investigators uncovered the full picture. This matters because it shows the scandal wasn't really contained to one building in Southlake, Texas. It exposed a wider network of evangelical leaders across multiple states who had been informed, in some form, about RobertMorris's history, and who, for years, chose institutional loyalty and reputation management over disclosure. According to one investigation by the Dallas Morning News, at least 11 North Texas pastors alone resigned or were removed for allegations of abuse, harassment, or what their own churches vaguely described only as a sin or moral failure in the year following Clemisher's story going public, suggesting Gateway's reckoning triggered, or at minimum coincided with, a much broader regional reckoning inside independent evangelical churches. Act 9, Her Lawyer, Her Fight, 54:30. It's worth pausing here to talk about who Cindy Clemisher turned to for help, because his background says something important about how seriously this case needed to be taken. Clemisher is represented by Boz Chivigian, the grandson of the late evangelist Billy Graham. Before becoming a civil attorney representing abuse survivors, Chivigian spent years as a prosecutor, where he created and led the first dedicated sex crimes division inside a Florida state attorney's office, working on more than 1,000 cases. In 2004, he founded an organization called Grace, Godly Response to Abuse in the Christian Environment, one of the leading groups specifically focused on helping evangelical institutions respond properly to abuse allegations, before stepping back from that role in 2020 to focus on direct legal representation of survivors. Chivigian has pointed specifically to the structural vulnerability of non-denominational churches like Gateway. Because they aren't formally connected to any larger religious body, there's no outside authority, no regional bishop, no presbytery, no equivalent governing structure that can step in and discipline a pastor the way more traditional denominations, at least on paper, are designed to allow. The accountability has to come entirely from within. And as this case shows, from within can mean almost no accountability at all for decades. Act 10, the settlement she turned down, 58:30. If the story so far makes it sound like Gateway simply didn't know until the public did, what happened a few months after Morris's resignation complicates that completely and reveals something Gateway never volunteered on its own. On October 3rd, 2024, Cindy Clemisher testified before a Texas House committee. It's worth pausing on how significant that moment was. A private citizen, a survivor of decades-old abuse, sitting in front of elected state lawmakers, describing not just what happened to her as a child, but how the institutions around her abuser had handled it since, and doing so in support of a specific piece of legislation, House Bill 748, also known as Trey's Law, named for Trey Carlock, a young man who died by suicide in 2019, shortly before his 29th birthday, after surviving abuse at a Christian summer camp years earlier. In that testimony, Clemisher revealed something Gateway had never put in any public statement. At some point, she had been offered a non-disclosure agreement, paired with a $25,000 settlement, an offer that would have legally bound her to permanent silence about what RobertMorris did to her starting when she was 12 years old. She turned it down. She also told lawmakers something that helps explain why it took her so long to come forward in the first place. She said she didn't fully accept, in her own mind, that what happened to her was a crime, rather than something she had somehow caused, until she was 35 years old. That's more than 2 decades after the abuse ended, and it lines up almost exactly with when she finally started writing to Morris's church email address in 2005. It's hard to overstate how much her decision to reject that NDA shaped everything that followed. Had she signed it, there's a real possibility this entire story never becomes public. RobertMorris could plausibly still be in Gateway's pulpit today. James Morris could already be the senior pastor, exactly as the succession plan intended. Her testimony helped move House Bill 748 forward. The committee approved it unanimously to advance to the full Texas House, and it helped catalyze a broader response from Representative Jeff Leach, chair of the House Judiciary Committee, who pointed specifically to how statutes of limitations from the 1980s had effectively run out the clock on holding people like Morris accountable for decades. And that wasn't rhetorical. Because of the statute of limitations in place in both Texas and Oklahoma at the time of the original abuse, Morris could not be criminally prosecuted or civilly sued for what happened to Clemenshire in the 1980s using the legal rules that existed back then. Everything that eventually led to handcuffs had to be built on a different legal foundation. Oklahoma's Attorney General would later clarify that because Morris had never actually been a resident of Oklahoma, the standard statute of limitations clock for a specific case worked differently than it would have for a resident defendant. That technical distinction is a meaningful part of why it took until 2025, more than 40 years after the abuse began, for actual criminal charges to even become legally possible. By November 2024, Gateway's leadership had a new, uncomfortable question to answer publicly. Who else inside the church had known, and for how long? The church hired an outside law firm, Haynes and Boone, to conduct what it called an independent and comprehensive investigation. Some results of that inquiry were shared publicly in November 2024, and they were damning. The investigation found that all but 3 of Gateway's sitting elders had been aware of Morris's history with Clemenshire, and aware of her age at the time the abuse began. Read that again. Not one elder who'd missed it, not 2, nearly the entire board, with the exception of just 3 people, already had this information before the public ever did. In response, the board, now operating under Chairman Charles Wilbanks, removed 4 sitting elders from leadership: Thomas Miller, Jeremy Carrasco, Kevin Grove, and Galen Losh, stating publicly that these men had either known the full scope of the allegations or should have known and failed to act. This is a good moment to talk about how megachurches like Gateway are actually governed, because it explains a lot about how something like this survives for 2 decades. Unlike denominations with built-in external oversight, a regional bishop, a national governing body, an outside accountability structure that exists independent of any one congregation, most large, independent, non-denominational megachurches are governed almost entirely by a small board of elders. And those elders are frequently handpicked, directly or indirectly, by the founding pastor himself. In theory, that board exists to provide a check on the pastor's behavior. In practice, when the pastor is also the institution's primary fundraising engine, its biggest media draw, and the person who built the board in the first place, that check can quietly stop functioning, which, according to Gateway's own outside investigation, is precisely what happened here for nearly the entire board for years. We're past the halfway mark, so let's quickly reset the timeline before we move into courtroom phase of the story. 1982. The abuse begins when Clemenshire is 12. 1987. Morris confesses to a different church's elders, gets quietly disciplined, and is eventually restored to ministry. 2000. He founds Gateway Church. 2005 and 2007. Clemenshire emails the church directly and then sends a formal legal demand. Both effectively go nowhere, while Morris's attorney pushes back by blaming her. 2024. The story finally breaks publicly. Morris resigns, and an outside investigation later finds nearly the entire elder board already knew. That's 4 decades, 2 churches, and at least 2 documented warnings, all before a single criminal charge was ever filed. Now here's where the legal system, for the first time, actually starts to catch up. The criminal case took shape where the abuse legally could still be prosecuted. Oklahoma, where it occurred. On March 12, 2025, a multi-county Oklahoma grand jury indicted RobertMorris on 5-count lewd or indecent acts with child, formal felony charges, backed by a grand jury's review of the evidence, not just a public allegation. Oklahoma Attorney General Gentner Drummond, whose office prosecuted the case, didn't soften his language at all. He said there could be no tolerance for those who sexually prey on children, and called this case especially despicable because the man accused had exploited his position as a pastor to do it, adding that the victim had waited far too many years for justice. In his official response to the indictment, Gateway's statement said the church was aware of the legal actions and was, in its words, grateful for the justice system's work holding abusers accountable, language that, after everything covered so far, reads very differently than it might have a year earlier. Morris made his first court appearance on May 9th, 2025, and pleaded not guilty to all 5 counts. At that point, legally, this was still very much a live fight. His public language up to that point had stayed at the level of inappropriate sexual behavior, still not the word abuse. But while the criminal case sat in that holding pattern, a second legal front was about to open up, one focused not on the original abuse, but on what Gateway's leadership had said about it afterward. On June 13th, 2025, Cindy Clemenshire and her father, Jerry Lee Clemenshire, filed a civil lawsuit. This one wasn't about 1982 through 1987. It was about June 2024 and everything Gateway's leadership said in the weeks after the story broke. The lawsuit named an extensive list of defendants: Gateway Church itself, RobertMorris, his wife Debbie Morris, and a roster of current and former elders and staff: Thomas Miller, Charles Wilbanks, Kevin Grove, Jeremy Carrasco, Kenneth Fambro, Galen Losh, Dane Miner, Steve Doolin, and the church's communications director, Lawrence Swicegood. The central claim: that by describing the abuse of a 12-year-old as an inappropriate relationship or an extramarital relationship with a young lady, the defendants had defamed Clemenshire by falsely implying she had been an older, willing, mature participant, rather than a child being abused by an adult roughly a decade older. The suit went further still, alleging that at various points Morris had characterized what happened as something closer to a consensual affair, even suggesting he had been seduced by Clemenshire while she was still a teenager. It also alleged that Morris, his wife, and the church had all financially benefited from concealing what they knew by allowing Morris to keep collecting a senior pastor's salary, ongoing book royalties, and speaking fees for years after leadership had reason to know the full truth. The lawsuit sought $1 million in damages. What followed wasn't a quick resolution. It was more than a year of dense legal trench warfare, and it's worth walking through in detail, because it shows exactly how an institution defends itself once the financial and reputational stakes become real. 3 of the 4 removed elders, Thomas Miller, Jeremy Carrasco, and Galen Losh, responded to the lawsuit with formal denials of wrongdoing, each building a slightly different legal shield. Carrasco argued that any statements attributed to him were either true, protected opinion, or simply never published, and that if Clemenshire's reputation had been damaged, that damage came from third parties outside his control. Miller argued he couldn't be liable for a true statement unless he deliberately distorted it, framing his comments as part of an internal investigation update to the congregation rather than an attempt to mislead anyone. Steve Doolin's filing leaned even further into reframing, describing his own past statements as honest regret for not having all the facts earlier, not deception. Gateway and several elders also reached for a law called the Texas Citizens Participation Act, an anti-SLAPP statute originally designed to protect ordinary people from being sued into silence for exercising free speech. Elders Kevin Grove and Steve Doolin tried to use it to get themselves dismissed from the case entirely. Dallas County Judge Emily Tobolowski denied that motion. From there, the defense escalated again, invoking a legal doctrine called ecclesiastical abstention, the principle that civil courts generally shouldn't wade into matters considered fundamentally religious or internal to a church's own governance. Attorneys for Gateway and its remaining independent elders argued that being forced to produce internal documents and sit for depositions would cause irreversible harm to the church's First Amendment rights, and they took the unusual step of appealing directly to the Dallas Court of Appeals to try to freeze the entire discovery process before it even began. Layer in a third front: insurance. In January 2026, Gateway's own insurer, Church Mutual Insurance Company, went to federal court seeking a ruling that it had no obligation to defend or financially cover Gateway, Morris, or the elders in this lawsuit at all. The company essentially telling its own policyholder, in writing, that this situation fell outside what it had agreed to insure. Despite every one of those maneuvers, the case kept moving forward. Back in November 2025, the judge had already ordered all defendants to begin producing internal and external communications about how Clemenshire's allegations were handled. Exactly the kind of paper trail an institution fights hardest to keep sealed. In February 2026, a Texas judge ruled the defamation suit could proceed, rejecting the elders' renewed attempts to be dismissed. Then, in March 2026, the case hit a temporary pause, Both sides agreed to clarify some of the judge's earlier rulings, while an appeals court reviewed whether the trial court even had jurisdiction to continue. But a jury trial date had already been locked in before that pause, June 15, 2026. If you're watching this anywhere close to that date, that trial may already be underway or may have just wrapped, which means there could be new sworn testimony about exactly what Gateway's leadership knew, and when that wasn't available at the time this video was made. While the civil case ground through motions and appeals, the criminal case in Oklahoma reached its conclusion first. On October 2nd, 2025, in an Osage County courtroom, RobertMorris pleaded guilty, not to a single reduced charge, but to all 5 original counts of lewd or indecent acts with a child. That distinction matters. This was a full admission in a court of law to 5 separate felony acts against a 12-year-old. The plea agreement structured his punishment in a way that immediately drew criticism from multiple directions. He received a 10-year sentence, but only the first 6 months were to be served in actual custody at the Osage County Jail. The remaining 9.5 years would be served on probation, supervised through an interstate compact once he returned to Texas. He was also ordered to register as a sex offender for the rest of his life and to pay Cindy Clemencher $270,000 in restitution and court costs. For context, Oklahoma's sentencing guidelines for these charges can carry penalties far harsher than what Morris ultimately served. The combination of negotiated plea, experienced legal representation, and a defendant with significant resources produce an outcome that critics, including some of Clemencher's own supporters, have pointed to as wildly out of proportion to what he just admitted doing, especially given that this marked the second time in his life he'd been formally confronted over this exact same conduct. There's also a smaller but telling detail buried in the legal record here. Even before the formal guilty plea, in a May 2025 filing tied to a separate dispute, Morris's own attorneys had already started using the phrase highly inappropriate relationship, still avoiding the word abuse, even with the criminal case actively moving toward resolution. RobertMorris walked out of the Osage County Jail just after midnight on a Tuesday in late March 2026, having completed his full 6-month custodial sentence. He released a statement through his attorneys the same day. He said his actions toward Clemencher decades earlier were wrong, that, in his words, there is no other word for it, and there is no excuse for it. He said he was grateful the Clemencher family had found the courage to bring everything into public view, and claimed he had sought their forgiveness privately years before any of this became public. Cindy Clemencher, for her part, had already said at the original sentencing that justice had finally arrived, more than 40 years after the abuse began. But it's worth sitting with what's actually closed here and what isn't. The criminal case is finished. RobertMorris will never serve more time for what happened to Cindy Clemencher as a child. What remains open is everything around that core fact. The institution that protected him, the people who knew, and, as it turns out, the money. Almost immediately after his release, attention shifted to a separate legal battle that had actually started months earlier, and revealed something deeply uncomfortable about how this entire saga has unfolded behind the scenes. While Morris was simultaneously fighting his criminal case in Oklahoma and managing his public image nationally, he was also in a Tarrant County courtroom fighting Gateway Church over money. His claims were broader than just a pension dispute. Morris sued for more than $1 million in deferred compensation and retirement benefits he said had been verbally promising beyond his official compensation agreement. And on top of that, he also claimed intellectual property rights over his own books, sermons, and social media accounts, material the church had spent years producing, hosting, and promoting on his behalf. Sit with that timeline for a second. A man who had pleaded guilty to sexually abusing a 12-year-old was in a different courthouse at the very same time, suing his former church for both a bigger payout and ownership of the media library built around his own name. That fight never reached a public jury. On May 20th, 2026, just weeks after Morris finished his jail sentence, Gateway Church and Morris agreed to move the retirement dispute into private arbitration, ending the Tarrant County court case before it would go to trial. That distinction matters more than it sounds. Arbitration is typically confidential. Both the proceedings and any resulting settlement usually stay out of public view, which means the public may never know exactly how much money or how much of his old media library RobertMorris ultimately walked away with from the church he built. Even after admitting, in an entirely different courtroom to a decades-long pattern of child sexual abuse. Here's where the story stops being just about one man and one church and starts being about something that actually changed because of it. Cindy Clemishier's public testimony in support of House Bill 748, and specifically her decision to reject that $25,000 non-disclosure agreement, helped fuel a legislative push in Texas that produced real, concrete law. In 2025, the Texas legislature passed Senate Bill 835, the formal version of Trey's Law, named for Trey Carlock, the young abuse survivor who died by suicide in 2019. It went into effect on September 1st, 2025, and it does something simple but significant. It makes non-disclosure agreements unenforceable in civil cases involving sexual abuse, human trafficking, or child sexual abuse. Survivors can no longer be legally bound to silence as a condition of settlement, and the law applies retroactively, meaning even NDAs signed years earlier can now be challenged in court. That same legislative session also produced Senate Bill 1167, which eliminated the civil statute of limitations entirely for lawsuits involving certain serious sexual offenses against children, and again applied that change retroactively, reopening the courthouse door for survivors who had previously been told their window had already closed. Texas lawmakers, including Representative Jeff Leach, explicitly pointed to cases like this one: survivors blocked by old statutes of limitations, institutions using settlements to keep abuse quiet, as the motivation behind these reforms. It's a rare thing in a story this dark, a concrete, lasting outcome. Whatever happens in the remaining lawsuits against Gateway, whatever the arbitration over Morris's retirement and media rights ultimately produces, the law in Texas is now permanently different than it was before Cindy Clemishier decided to say no to $25,000 and a gag order. It's tempting to treat the Gateway story as a singular, shocking anomaly, one bad man, one unusually long cover-up. But the structural pattern here: a charismatic founder, an internally loyal elder board, warning signs absorbed rather than escalated, careful language deployed the moment a story threatens to break, isn't unique to one church in Southlake, Texas. We already saw it echo at New Life Church in Colorado Springs, hundreds of miles away, where a different pastor sat on emails about the same allegation for years before resigning, and across at least 11 other North Texas churches that saw their own pastors resign or get removed in a year following Clemishier's story going public. Look at how megachurch governance generally works across the country: an independent, non-denominational structure with no outside denominational authority to answer to, an elder board often selected by, and financially dependent on, the very pastor they're meant to oversee, and a media and publishing apparatus that gives that pastor enormous incentive, financial and reputational, to manage any allegation quietly rather than escalate it publicly. That structure doesn't guarantee abuse will happen, but when it does happen, that same structure is remarkably effective at containing it. First in 1987, again through 2005 and 2007, and again almost in 2024 until one survivor refused to let it happen a third time. Strip away the specific names, and the shape of the story is depressingly familiar. A charismatic founder builds an institution almost entirely around his own personal brand. Warning signs: a 1987 confession, a 2005 email, a 2007 legal demand, a 2020 cover-up settlement, a 2023 harassment settlement, get absorbed and managed rather than escalated. A small, internally loyal board of elders controls the flow of information to the public. And when the truth finally breaks through anyway, the first instinct from leadership isn't transparency. It's careful language, inappropriate sexual behavior. A young lady, never a 12-year-old child. What makes this case worth an hour of your time isn't just what RobertMorris did to one girl in the 1980s. It's how many separate times, across more than 4 decades, an institution, first one church, then another, then an entire ecosystem of television networks, a Bible college, political allies, an outside law firm, an insurance company, and a small army of attorneys, found a way to manage this instead of stopping it. And it's how much deliberate, repeated effort it took from one woman to finally break through all of it, and how much that empire ultimately lost. In members, in money, in leadership, and now, in 2 separate American legal codes, once she did. Cindy Clemishier didn't just survive what happened to her as a child. She sent the email nobody acted on in 2005. She sent a formal legal demand in 2007 and watched the lawyer blame her for what an adult man did to her at 12. She turned down the settlement designed to silence her in 2024. She testified in front of state lawmakers in support of a law named for another survivor who didn't make it. And the law in Texas is now permanently different because she did all of that. As of this recording, parts of this story are still unresolved. A civil trial that may have just happened or may still be coming. A confidential arbitration that will likely never become fully public. But the part of this story that's already finished tells you almost everything you need to know about how institutions like this protect themselves. First once, then again, right up until the moment one person refuses to let them. If this pattern sounds familiar, if you want to see how this exact playbook is played out at other major churches with other survivors, other elder boards, and other settlements, that's exactly what we're covering next.